be the language, the ideas, the thoughts, the imagination of common man should be reflected. The second one, poetry should be understandable to anybody living in the world. So poetry is not the monopoly of certain class or particular class. It should be understandable to any person of the world. So we can say that universality of the idea here. The third one, the subjects of the poem should also be accessible to all individuals regardless of class or position. So the subject should be arranged or presented in such a way that any individual of the world, of any corner, he can understand. Not in particular class or position it should be spreaded. Moreover, that Wordsworth asserts that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Friends, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Third year BA students, they know Wordsworth poem Daffodils, 10,000 at a glance. Wordsworth saw 10,000 daffodils at a glance. So that spontaneous overflow of feelings, he was very happy on the sight of that 10,000 daffodils in single sight. But his ideas, he polished, he ordered, he molded the ideas. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. We'll see this example later on. Fifth one, these feelings leave an individual incapable of articulating the true nature and beauty of the event. Sixth one, it's only when this emotion is recollected in tranquility that the poet can assemble words to do the instance justice. Here, see the fourth one first. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. In sixth one, Wordsworth says that the ideas recollected in tranquility. So, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings arranged, shaped, molded in tranquility when the poet gets his own ideas in shape. Moreover, that Wordsworth asserts that in his Daffodils, Wordsworth expresses his ideas, spontaneous overflow of emotion recollected in tranquility as focus on these lines, friends. In the very first lines, he says that I saw 10,000 at a glance, and here, for oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, the flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So, this is molding, this is shaping of the ideas. The daffodils he saw on the bank of the river nearby a tree, and those flowers were dancing and tossing their heads. But when he recollects his memory about those particular flowers, those particular daffodils, he arranges his ideas like this. Next slide, please. Wordsworth says that poems to which any value can be attached will never produce a man who, being possessed of more that usual organic sensibility, had also thought long and deep. We are going to discuss about organic sensibility later on, friends. Next slide, please. Now we are going to focus on Wordsworth theory of poetic diction. What is that? Wordsworth protested against the traditions and usages set up by the pseudo-classical school of 18th century. in the very first slides, we discussed about Wordsworth rebellion, Wordsworth protest against the tradition and the rich, ornamental, coarse language of 18th century poetry. Wordsworth says he gives his view about language. Language to be employed in poetry, it should be of common man. But his poetic diction, his theory of poetic diction, that the language should be of common man and it should be very simple. It raised an issue, it raised a storm of protest against him, including his friend Coleridge. He gave his reactions about this theory of diction by Wordsworth. Coleridge's critique on Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction. Let us discuss about this. Coleridge did not accept the theory that the ideal language of poetry is natural conversation of man under the influence of natural feelings. As we know, the most of the characters by Wordsworth are from rustic, from countryside. For example, you can take Solitary Reaper. So Coleridge says that the language of poetry should be rich, it should be ornamental, and it should not involve the natural conversation of man under the influence of natural feeling also. Moreover, he says that a poem cannot be condemned only on the ground of differing from the language of real life. Two different societies are there. One is of countryside and the second is urban life, but we cannot put an emphasis on being pure to the country life and urban life contaminated or something impure. So both the languages should be given enough importance. So a poem cannot be condemned only on the ground of differing from the language of real life. It is applicable to certain classes of poetry and need not be practiced as a rule. Coldri says that the language of rustic people or a language of common man, it should be restricted. It should not be practiced as a rule in general for all the poetry. Coleridge's main objections are: first one is that uneducated rustic would furnish a very scanty vocabulary. Any piece of literature or any work of literature should be ornamental. The language should be a little bit different from the everyday language or colloquial language. The second one, the words and their combinations can be justified, say, to form the best part of language. One more objection by Coleridge is the rustic language varies from locality to locality. Friends, let us discuss about this locality to locality. Most of us, we use our mother language in our houses and for colloquial language. So locality to locality, if you are in Ahmedabad, you say in Gujarati that tamne bolave che. In Saurashtra, you will say that tamne barke che, and in North Gujarat, if you are there, tamne sade che. So this difference between locality to locality is there, and Coleridge protests against this, the language of common man. Look at this slide, please. So he says that rustic language varies from locality to locality. So how can each and every person who is sitting there in country can understand the language of the poetry from the other corner of that particular area? The fourth one, the expression depends on the general truths, conceptions and images and words already stored in mind. Next slide, please. Fifth one is lower diction and content shows poets' poor vocabulary and thoughts. Poetry should be rich, poetry should be ornamental, but if he is not allowed or he is expected to use the language of common man, the store of vocabulary will be very, very small, and this creates impression of the lower diction, and content shows the poet's poor vocabulary and thoughts. Now, let us discuss about Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge wrote the Biographia Literaria. It's one of Coleridge's main critical studies. This text is a discussion about, first one, elements of writing, and secondly, what writing should be considered genius. Coleridge's theory of imagination and fancy is there. Let us focus on this imagination and fancy. It focuses mainly on imagination as key to poetry. Coleridge divided this imagination of nature, imagination of ideas. He divided imagination into two main concepts. First one is the primary imagination. Second one is the secondary imagination. The primary imagination is a spontaneous creation of new ideas, and it is the living power and the prime agent of all human perception, as we saw the example of spontaneous flow of powerful feelings, overflow of powerful feelings. So that is the spontaneous creation of new ideas, fresh ideas. And secondly, the secondary imagination is mitigated by conscious act of imagination. That's an effort to put the ideas together and shape the imagination. What is fancy? What is fancy? According to Coleridge, it is the lowest form of imagination. With only fancy, there is no creation involved. Friends, we see dews in the morning, we see rain, we see rainbow in the sky, we see the different natural aspects, but only that particular spontaneous overflow cannot give a way to poetry. So this only spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings is not the base of any poetry. It is simply a reconfiguration of existing ideas. There are some ideas in the minds of poets. For example, if Kalapi is there in Gujarati literature, he sees a very good morning like this morning, today's morning, and he writes one poem, Uge che surkhi bari, like Gram Mata. So the ideas are there in his mind, but he gives shape to these ideas with the impression, with the reflection of the particular nature or particular scene as he sees in the nature. So with only fancy, there is no creation involved. So there should be combination of imagination and fancy. First come the imagination and then fancy. Now let us discuss about Coleridge's theory of asemplastic. What is this asemplastic? Asemplastic is a Greek word which means to shape into one and to convey a new sense. Here in the reference of Biographia Literaria, it means the function of molding into unity or unifying. This simply means that the poet, whatever he sees in the nature, he, according to his own imagination, according to his own intellect, according to his own ideas, he molds all these impressions and he puts these impressions and these ideas in a shape. So asemplastic is a Greek word which means to shape into one and to convey a new sense, the function of molding into unity or to unify. According to Coleridge, the poet relied on both fancy and imagination. As we saw in Wordsworth also, the first phase is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and the second phase is the rearranging or giving shape or molding the ideas. So, according to Coleridge, the poet relied on both at a time fancy and imagination. Moreover, he says that poets should seek a balance between the active and the transformative. What is this active, friends? This active is once again those powerful feelings from the nature, especially in reference with romantics. And what is this transformative? This transformation of the ideas, the transformation of the first impression of any scene or any episode or any instance from the nature. So, poets should seek a balance, a perfect balance between both this active and transformative, and that's the balance of fancy and imagination. Friends, let us discuss about Coleridge's demerits. Coleridge was condemned in 19th century that his views are too philosophical. Wordsworth and Coleridge both are contemporaries, as we know, both are from the romantic field, and here Coleridge's ideas are Coleridge's views on criticism are too philosophical. Wordsworth, as we know, Wordsworth worshipped nature, and Coleridge put philosophy in his ideas and his poetry through the symbols of nature. He uses symbols of nature, aspects of nature in his poetry to give philosophy. For example, let us discuss about Coleridge's Rime of Ancient Mariner. He puts the symbol of albatross. The mariner kills that particular albatross